Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Connor Barth. I'm the Vice President of the George Mason University Econ Society. And I have here with me today Caitlin Woltz. She is a PhD candidate in economics at George Mason University, a PhD fellow with the Mercatus Center, and a graduate fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Her research interests lie at the intersection of the political economy of the criminal justice system, development economics, and market process economics. And she is here with us today to talk about the prisoner's voice in the criminal justice system. So I will give way to Caitlin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connor, for that introduction. And thank you for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you and the audience about my research.
Awesome. Oh, and I'm sorry, before we begin, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of her presentation if you have any questions for her. So please stick around for that.
Yes, and please ask questions. That's the most fun part, honestly. All right, so just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, I want to dive briefly into how economists think about crime in the criminal justice system so that everyone has a sort of understanding about how we think about that in economics. And then from there, I'll get into my own research, which examines prisoner voice, as Connor mentioned.
Awesome.
So let's get started. So when we think about the economics of crime, there are two main sort of strands of thought that economists use. The first is rational choice theory. And rational choice theory very much applies to the individual's decision. So that decision to commit crime, and then those decisions about how to best punish people who commit crime. And rational choice theory just says that people will commit crime when the benefits of doing so outweigh the cost. So if you look at the picture on the slide of the guy picking the lock, so he's decided that the benefits of doing so, being able to get whatever is inside that room, outweigh the costs of potentially getting caught. And when economists are advising people on how to best craft punishment, they're going to be focusing on raising the cost of that crime. So whether that's through, for example, incarceration, where people are detained, removed from their families and experience a deprivation of resources, that potential experience theoretically increases the cost of crime, and so should deter people from making that decision to commit crime. Individually, we each also try to increase the cost of others committing crimes against us. So for example, probably most of you have a lock on your door, and most of you use that lock on your door. And that's in a way to marginally increase the cost of someone entering your house without your permission. Other people, you might even have security systems that will alarm, and then thereby further raise the cost of entering your home. And so this is how, this is an example of how economists using rational choice theory think about the decision that people make to commit crime, as well as how people try to deter that crime. When thinking more about the criminal justice system and criminal justice officials specifically, that's when we want to start using more public choice economics. And public choice economics is very much founded in rational choice theory, but examining those people working within political institutions instead of market institutions. And they're focusing on the incentives that those political institutions generate and how they're different from the market institutions that people are usually acting within. And so my research, as we get into it, is going to very much draw on public choice insights and apply them to the criminal justice system. Just to give you a quick story, because I love this story about Gary Becker, who's sort of the father of the field of economics of crime. His article, Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach, very much gave birth to this field. And it actually came to him when he was on his way to a dissertation defense. He was running a little bit late, and as I'm sure many of you have experienced at Mason, was having trouble finding a parking spot. And so while trying to park, he realized, I could just park illegally and make sure that I get to this defense on time. And in that moment, realized that he had done a sort of rational calculus about the decision to commit crime. For him, as the professor on the committee, the cost of parking illegally, any potential fine he might have to pay were, in his mind, below the benefits of getting to that dissertation defense. And as the story goes, he walked into the defense and continued to quiz the graduate student on the economics of crime, even though that wasn't the student's dissertation topic. And so that now we have the birth of this field and lots of research that's come from that. Turning to public choice, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was very much begun by James M. Buchanan, who was actually professor here at George Mason when he won the Nobel Prize in 1986. And sort of central to public choice is this idea that he wrote about of politics without romance. So prior to his work, many scholars assumed that political officials, political officers were altruistic, perfectly altruistic, that everything they did was to serve their constituents, to serve voters' interests. And what Buchanan suggested was actually when people go from the market to the political sphere, they don't just become angels all of a sudden. And so we should really apply the same assumptions to people acting within political institutions that we do to people acting within market institutions. So we should really assume that political officials are self-interested, that their behavior is only going to align with the interests of voters when they're monitored, when they face costs for not following with voters' interests. And this led to, in particular, the development of an economics of bureaucracy. So looking at how political bureaucracies function, what incentives do those hierarchical relationships generate, especially within the political sphere. And that's what I'm going to be leveraging in my own research. So quickly, before I get into my own research, I just want to showcase a couple scholars working in the economics of crime. And they focus very much on issues that people who are formerly incarcerated experience once they've been released. So to begin with, Jennifer Doliak, who's here on the right, I believe she's on the right for you too. Her work has focused on ban the box policies. And so for anyone not familiar with this, ban the box policies just suggest that employers should remove the box on applications that ask people to tell them about their previous history, right? Were you ever convicted of a crime? And the thinking behind this is if you eliminate that box, eliminate that question, you're going to lower the costs of the formerly incarcerated getting legal jobs, and thereby increase the number of those formerly incarcerated people who get jobs, and thereby reduce recidivism, which is a large concern when studying the criminal justice system. So just real quick, recidivism refers to someone being rearrested after their release. So if I was released from prison and then, a few months later in the neighborhood I'm living in, a corner store, a convenience store is robbed, I might get arrested as the suspect for that crime because of my previous history. So even regardless of if I'm convicted of that or not, ultimately guilty of that crime or not, I will have been considered as having recidivated by the institutions. And so this ban the box policy suggested that if we lower the cost of people, the formerly incarcerated, to accessing legal jobs, getting legal jobs, then we'll reduce recidivism because people won't have to return to crime. They won't be arrested again for new crimes. What Jennifer Doliak finds is that this doesn't happen. It doesn't work. So when employers remove the box asking about previous history, we don't see formerly incarcerated people getting more jobs. And in fact, what we do see is actually an increase in racial discrimination by employers. So because employers don't have access to that information about previous criminal histories, they're now using race as a proxy for having committed a crime. And so what she finds is that actually not only do the formerly incarcerated not get hired more, but that young Black men also get hired less. And so it has these large unintended consequences. Another researcher whose work I wanted to talk about is Glenn Lowry, and he's here on the left. His research in the criminal justice system has focused on issues related to recidivism again. And so what he examines is how the social capital or social networks that formerly incarcerated people have are going to affect their ability to find legal work and stay out of the criminal justice system. And his work focuses primarily on Black communities. And he argues that because people in Black communities have less social capital beyond those communities, so in other words, their social networks are very much limited to that community, it's going to be more difficult for them to find legal work. And thus, as we see, high rates of recidivism among those people in those communities who are formerly incarcerated. And this becomes even worse when you consider, as is the case in the US, the huge racial disparity that we have in our prison population. So ignoring this issue of social capital and how it affects recidivism for a moment, prior to that question, we're already seeing a disproportionate number of people in Black communities being incarcerated in the first place. And so not only are those social capitals that the formerly incarcerated in Black communities have really limited to those communities, a higher percentage of the people in those communities are that themselves also going to be formerly incarcerated. And so you're going to see this entrenchment of people in Black communities in crime. So that's what his focus has been. So both of these researchers have focused very much on legislation and policy issues that the formerly incarcerated face after their release from prison. Now, what my research does is actually look at the prison system itself and the criminal justice system itself and see how we can get effective reforms of those institutions. This is in part motivated by not only the protests that we saw this summer calling for criminal justice reform, but also by the fact that sort of the 200 years of criminal justice reform that we've seen in the US has been characterized by failure. Reforms that are put into place often just exacerbate the issues they are meant to address. And so my question is, going into my research is, can prisoners have any role in this criminal justice reform as a way to think about, okay, we've had these reform efforts by people acting outside of the system. Can the people within the system have a role in guiding effective reform efforts? And so what I argue in my research is that prisoner voice can actually serve as an information channel within criminal justice bureaucracies and thereby hold criminal justice officials accountable for their behavior. And what I ultimately find when I examine 3 avenues for prisoner voice, prisoner journalism, prisoner litigation, and prison riots, is that 2 of these avenues, prison journalism and prisoner litigation, are able to influence reform. Prisoners are able to influence reform through those 2 avenues, but it's only prison journalism that influences reform in ways that align with voters' interests. The others I find have unintended consequences, and we'll get into this in a minute. So getting into this, I just want to show you quickly the theory of criminal justice bureaucracy that I develop in this research. And like I mentioned before, I'm building on the economics of bureaucracy literature coming out of the public choice economics. So within the economics of bureaucracy, there are 2 main assumptions. The first is that bureaucrats are budget maximizers, and this is going to include maximizing their power. So any bureaucrat is going to want to get promoted and thereby increase their power, as well as increase the resources they have access to. Secondly, each of these bureaucrats you can model as being at once a superior and a subordinate. So this will be more apparent if we look at this generalized organizational chart of state criminal justice bureaucracies. And I just want to note that in my research, I'm very much focusing on state bureaucracies, on state criminal justice systems, because in the US, it is the state systems that drive our criminal justice system. If you compare the federal system to state systems, even just the California system, it's much smaller. And so if we want to have effective reform, it's going to have to be focused on the state systems. So just to go over this chart, because of course we're a democracy, voters are going to be considered the ultimate sovereign in the criminal justice bureaucracy, so the sort of top dog. Voters are going to elect legislators and judges, as we're all aware, as well as a governor. The governor then is going to appoint parole board members, as well as a commissioner to oversee the prison system. And then the commissioner is going to appoint a warden at each prison to oversee the correctional officers there, who then manage the prisoners. And just a quick note, so depending on the prison you're at, you're going to have separate correctional officers and treatment officials, where the correctional officers simply manage the movement of prisoners in the prison, while treatment officials manage the programming, like classes or movie nights or anything like that. But depending on the prison, you'll have either separate people serving these roles, or if it's a smaller prison, correctional officers will do both. So I'm going to primarily talk about correctional officers, but it can be a stand-in for treatment officials as well. Now, these state The state criminal justice system is, of course, nested in a federal system since we are a federal government. Again, the voters are going to be considered the ultimate sovereigns because, again, we're a democracy. And so voters are going to be electing a president as well as congresspeople. And then the president will nominate judges who the congresspeople approve, and we get judges filling those seats in the federal court. And then these three branches will all oversee state governments. And this is going to include the operation of state criminal justice systems. So the president and Congress will be providing legislation with which to guide what sort of crimes the state systems enforce or prosecute. And then at the federal level, the judges are going to be ensuring that the state criminal justice systems do not violate the Constitution. So at any moment, a bureaucrat is going to have a choice to either pursue the interests of their superior or to pursue their own interests. And if they pursue their own interests, this is very much going to be in conflict with those interests of her superior. So which the bureaucrat chooses to do is going to depend on whether or not she's monitored. So if the superior chooses not to monitor their subordinate, then that subordinate is going to prefer to pursue their own interests. And in doing so, they're able to not only do what they want, but also not jeopardize any job of promotion. You can simply tell their superior that, hey, yeah, I followed your instructions, when in fact they didn't. In contrast, if the superior does monitor their subordinate, then that subordinate will prefer to follow the superior's directions. If they don't, they very much jeopardize their chances of promotion. And so what we see, and if any of you are familiar with the principal agent problem, is that monitoring produces this incentive alignment where the subordinates' preferences align with those of their superior and all the way up the hierarchy. So as you might guess from what I've said so far, a bureaucrat's greatest power is going to be over the information that they control. So a superior is going to want the most accurate information about their subordinate's behavior that they can have. And a subordinate is going to want to ensure that their superior only receives beneficial or positive information about their behavior. So what information a superior gets depends on the type and quality of information channels that exist within a bureaucracy. So when we talk about information channels in a bureaucracy, there are two types. The first is an external information channel. These channels operate outside of the bureaucracy, and they're most often consists of media. So media reports on the outcomes of a bureaucracy and thereby allows the superior to monitor their subordinates through the reporting of those outcomes. For the criminal justice system, however, the media doesn't have access to prisons. So, and even when they do, it's very much limited and controlled by the wardens. So what I've done in my theory of criminal justice bureaucracy is just assume that these channels don't exist and focus instead on the internal information channels, which is our second type of information channel that can exist within a bureaucracy. And these channels operate very much within the bureaucracy. And they're most commonly just the subordinate reporting to their superior. As you might guess, though, these information channels then are going to be liable to manipulation by the subordinates. The subordinates can simply lie in their reports and say that they're obeying the superior's instructions when in fact they're not. And of course, the superior knows this. And so one thing that they might do is rely on their subordinate for information about their direct subordinates' behavior. And for the purposes of my research, this can potentially include relying on prisoners for information about their subordinates. So just to provide a quick example, let's return to this organizational chart of state criminal justice bureaucracies. So an example of this sort of information channel would be the warden using prisoners to report on correctional officers, okay? Or you could have the governor relying on the warden to report about the commissioner. So those are the sorts of information channels I'm talking about, the subordinate reporting on their superior. All right. And then lastly, with regard to reform, What the economics of bureaucracy tells us is that superiors will only change the bureaucratic institutions in order to increase compliance by their subordinates. So what we expect is that if superiors learn from prisoners that their subordinates are defecting, then they should implement reforms. They're not going to implement reforms simply because prisoners complain, for instance. So just to summarize real quick, the predictions that I generate from this theory. First, the first prediction says, if prisoner voice avenues serve as internal information channels, then they will communicate information about the activities of the subordinates of whichever bureaucrat formally establishes them. So just for example, if the warden sets up a prisoner voice channel, then we should expect that channel to communicate information about the correctional officers. Second, if prisoner voice avenues serve as internal information channels, then subordinates should try to gain control of those avenues in order to ensure that they're only communicating positive information about their performance. Third, criminal justice bureaucrats will only implement reforms when they learn that their subordinates are defecting. And lastly, that these reforms will only align with voters' interests when voters have access to prisoner voice avenues. Because remember, go back to that principal agent problem. Only if voters are monitoring the criminal justice officials do we expect any actions by those officials, including reform, to align with voters' interests. So now just to get into the evidence, like I mentioned previously, I examined prison journalism along with prisoner litigation and prison riots as potential avenues for prisoner voice to test if they do serve as internal information channels and if my hypothesis is ultimately correct. And so beginning with prison journalism, for anyone who hasn't heard of prison journalism before, which is probably most people, it just refers to newspapers and magazines that are written and produced by prisoners. These publications circulate not only within prisons, but also outside of them. So I actually receive the San Quentin News in the mail every month. These newspapers and magazines varied as well in their size and publication frequency. So some, like I'll talk about in a second, were simply 4 pages and they were published weekly, while others actually exceeded 100 pages and were published every other month. So there's quite a variation into what these publications look like. In addition to this, and what's important for this research is that the wardens actually controlled all aspects of prison newspapers. So wardens controlled all of the funding, and often when we see prison newspapers shut down, it's because the warden has redirected the newspaper's funding. The wardens also controlled the staff of the newspapers, so no prisoner serves on a newspaper staff unless the warden says they can, and often the staff is appointed directly by the warden. And then lastly, the warden also controls all of the published content of the newspapers. So as you can see here, the warden actually censored the story in this top picture. And in response, the prison journalists printed censored in place of the story. And this was actually a little cheeky of them. It was not okayed by the warden. And as a result, this publication actually shut down shortly after this issue was published. So this was actually the San Quentin News in 1980. So it shut down shortly after this issue and then didn't resume again until 2008. And when it resumed in 2008, it included this mission statement that said that the warden, Robert Ayers, determined that having a newspaper would be beneficial to the population of the prison. So these prison newspapers existed across the US. They've been published out of every state except for New Hampshire, and they've also been published out of DC. They have existed for a long time. So the first prison newspapers we see were actually published in 1800. There were 2, both coming out of what were known as debtors' prisons. They operated for a few months and then shut down. And then we didn't see really any prison newspapers until 1880. So from 1880, as you can see in the graph here, the number of prison newspapers in the US rose until it reached its height in the 1960s, when there were almost 250 separate publications circulating in the US. And then after the mid-60s, we see these publications begin to shut down and shut down quickly until today, when there are about 10 newspapers still in operation in the US. So to get to our predictions, the first prediction says that if prison newspapers do indeed serve as internal information channels, then we should see them communicating information about warden subordinates, so namely correctional officers and treatment officials. And this is what I find. So most of these publications include reports on prison events and prison programming. So things like sports events, prisoners' clubs, any reaction to movie nights, any hiccups at mealtime. And these are important for the warden to monitor his subordinates, because these are the things that correctional officers and treatment officials are responsible for. They're responsible for ensuring that prisoners get to where they're supposed to be in a prison, and that on the treatment official side, that those programs go off without any hitch. And so so you can see here, this clipping, I believe, is from the Echo coming out of Texas, and it just documents the chess tournament that happened at the prison that day. In addition to this, Bard, who conducted a survey of these prison newspapers in 1966, found that at the time, of the 56 publications he surveyed, 50 of them dedicated over 50% of their space to general prison news. So documenting prison events definitely constituted the majority of the prison newspapers. I also want to show you some qualitative evidence about the newspaper's content. So I'll be going over articles pulled from each of these publications. So first, The Reflector, published in 1950. The editor at the time wrote an article asking correctional officers to stop referring to prisoners as "hey boy" or "hey man," and he said that this contributed to confusion in the prison, that often a prisoner didn't know that the correctional officer was addressing him because he didn't use his name. And this is important because it can very much contribute to violence in the prison. Ignoring a correctional officer can be grounds for a write-up for a prisoner. And so this sort of confusion would be detrimental to the order of the prison. In the Deaftown Journal, which was published at a Missouri State Prison Penitentiary in 1959, prison journalists there suggested that the prison administration should actually change what prisoners were being shown during movie night. They said that they're bored of the cartoons that they were shown each week and wanted it instead to be shown that prisoners are unhappy with the sort of programming that treatment officials are providing. So Connor, I just got a notice that my internet is unstable. Do I need to go back at all?
No, I do not think that the broadcast was interrupted based on what I've seen.
Okay, great, thanks.
I'll keep
going. Yeah, great. So looking at the Angolite in Louisiana State Penitentiary, this issue published in 1979 found that, published a prisoner's complaint about the policies of the mailroom officials. So mailroom officials at the time would often stamp the censor stamp onto the front face of letters. So like if you ever have received a greeting card, the nice picture that's on the front of that card, or on the actual letter itself, often making it unreadable. And so this prisoner wrote to the Angolite making this complaint. And by publishing it, the Angolite is providing that information that, hey, these mail officials, these mailroom prison officials are not doing their job. They're actually doing this thing that is contributing to unrest and dissatisfaction in the prison. And then lastly, this is from the San Quentin News, published in 2009. The prison journalists there actually published an article that detailed the poor conditions in solitary confinement at the time. They noted how prisoners there had no blankets, they were living in dirty cells, and often received no utensils with which to eat their food, and so were having to eat by hand. And these, just so for context, these sorts of things are actually what have been found to be unconstitutional in through previous prisoner litigation in the US. And so these are things which the warden is very much concerned with. All right, next prediction. So if prison newspapers serve as internal information channels, then correctional officers should try to gain control of them. There's less evidence for this, and I can talk about why I think that is in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But I do have a couple of examples coming from Louisiana and California. So first, this is coming from Wilbert Redoux's memoir. Wilbert Redoux is a pretty famous prisoner, former prisoner who served as the editor of the Angolite from 1976, Angolite staff in 1976 as the editor. He went to the warden at the time and asked for a camera so that the staff could better document, things happening at the prison. And in response, the correctional officers at Louisiana State Penitentiary actually went to the warden and formally objected to the Angolite staff having a camera. And as I've bolded here, they said that they were afraid that the newspaper staff would take photos of them doing something embarrassing. And so in this way, they're trying to shut down the journalists' ability to monitor their behavior. And then looking at San Quentin News. So this is a follow-up article that was published the month after the initial article about the conditions in solitary confinement. The correctional officers at San Quentin had actually demanded that the journalists publish their responses to that article. And I've just pulled one of those responses here. So correctional officer Lieutenant R. Luna said that the story was one-sided, that he couldn't speak to the inaccuracies because it hadn't been investigated, and that that article was just an opinion of 4 individuals. And so very much trying to downplay the information provided by the journalists and cast doubt on its veracity. So the third prediction says that wardens will implement reforms when they learn that correctional officers are defecting. And this, again, I find, so with regard to the Deaftown Journal's complaint about prisoners being bored of the cartoons and wanting to be shown newsreels instead, the warden actually decided not to do anything to make any changes. And so this is an important finding, I think, in my research, because it goes to show that the warden isn't concerned with the prisoner's happiness or entertainment. He just wants to make sure that the correctional officers are getting the prisoners to the movie night and that the treatment officials are playing that movie. And after that point, he doesn't care. And so, like I said, I think this is an important example showing that the warden's not responding to any complaint of the prisoners, only those that tell him that his subordinates are not doing their job. Second, returning to the issue with the mailroom at Louisiana State Penitentiary, in response to the prisoner's complaint that the administration there actually changed the mailroom policies and said that the mailroom would no longer place the stamp on the face of the greeting cards and instead would consider only placing it on the back of letters. And so you have this adjustment to mailroom policies in response to something that could cause tension and unrest in the prison. Because mail is very much something that it's a prisoner's only connection with the outside world often. And then looking again at the San Quentin News, returning to the story about solitary confinement. So this wasn't published in the San Quentin News itself. I've actually found this in a book on the history of the San Quentin News. And in it, the author interviewed the prison editor at the time that these articles were published. And the editor reported that after those stories, that the conditions in solitary confinement did improve. And that's what we would expect. The warden wants to make sure that the prison is abiding by constitutional rules. And so they're going to make sure that there's really bare minimum things like a blanket, a clean environment, and utensils. And so you do get that marginal improvement in conditions. And then lastly, do these reforms align with voters' interests? And the prediction says that they will, but only if voters have access to these newspapers. And so that's what I find. I have some rough circulation data of the outside circulation of these publications. And as you can see, it follows the rise and fall of these publications in the US. And these outside subscribers, from what I found, included community members, reporters, lawyers, and judges, as well as other people in the community. So since voters did have access to these newspapers, next we need to know what are their preferences about prisons. So looking at responses from the Gallup survey, what I find is that there are two main things that voters are interested in with regard to the criminal justice system. The first is shown by this graph on the right, and it simply shows us that the majority of people over time from the 80s to today think that the criminal justice system is not tough enough. So they primarily, want a tougher criminal justice system. So this is going to include things like longer sentences or even worse, harsher conditions. The other main theme that I find, and this is shown in the graph on the left, is that voters tend to want less spending on prisons. So only a minority of responders wanted more spending on prisons than police and courts. And when this question is actually asked as a trade-off, would you rather more spent on prison or crime or schools? People prefer more spent on schools, and these percent of respondents who actually want more spent on crime fall to about 20, down from 30 or 40. And so just to summarize, voters tend to want harsher prison conditions and less money spent on those prisons. And I argue that the reforms that prison journalists influence do in fact align with these interests. We don't see any changes in prison conditions beyond what's constitutionally required. And we see changes in policies that are aimed at reducing tension and maintaining order. We also see other changes influenced by prison journalists, but these changes are less relevant for this research in particular. But if anyone's interested, I'm happy to go into it. So next, prisoner litigation. So prisoner litigation just refers to civil suits that are filed by prisoners at the federal level. Prior to 1964, prisoners were not allowed to sue in federal court. For a long time, beginning in the 1800s, judges followed what's known as the hands-off doctrine. They thought that, prisons are the responsibility of prison officials and state officials, and we shouldn't get involved. And then in 1964, that changed with a ruling in Cooper v. Pate, and judges began allowing prisoners to file suits. And so this can be understood as federal judges establishing an information channel from the prison to them, to that federal courts. And so my first prediction says that if prisoner litigation does indeed serve as an internal information channel, then it will communicate information about the federal judge's subordinates. So this is going to include the state legislators, the governor, state prison officials, all the way down to the correctional officers in the prison. And this is what I find. The suits that prisoners file very much address rights violations by prison officials and the lack of resources, which would be the responsibility of the legislature. These suits addressed physical assaults, inadequate medical care, due process violations within the prison, and then complaints about living conditions, so sanitation and nutrition. Second, if prisoner litigation does serve as an internal information channel, then state officials should try to gain control of it. And again, this is what I find. So in the 1990s, state officials began lobbying for what became known as the Prison Litigation Reform Act. They argued that the federal courts were being inundated with frivolous prisoner suits, and so a sort of filter needed to be put in place so that only the most meritorious suits made it to federal court, and the rest would be handled by state courts. So this legislation passed in 1996, and what we see is a fall in the number of prisoner suits as well as the number of successful suits. So these suits actually dropped by 43%, despite there being a 23% increase in the US prison population from 1996 to 2001. And then looking from 1996 to 2008, these suits continue to drop, and they dropped by 60%. And despite what the prison litigation reform proponents said, these suits were not reallocated to state courts. State courts continued to follow the hands-off doctrine, much like they had prior to 1964. And so we see the subordinates of the judges able to gain control of prisoner litigation and shut it down. So third prediction says that federal judges will implement reforms when they learn that state officials are violating the Constitution. And this is again what I find. So prior to the Prison Litigation Reform Act, federal courts intervened in several state prison systems when they found that prisoners' constitutional rights were violated. So this happened in Florida, Texas, as well as Alabama and Arkansas. And these injunctions often asked the state prison systems to reduce overcrowding in the prison, as well as other environmental concerns. Explicitly in many of these rulings, judges were wanting the states to release prisoners to reduce overcrowding, right? Reduce the population and thus reduce overcrowding. But what we see happen is instead that the states built more prisons in order to reduce overcrowding at each individual prison. So it wasn't the reform that judges had intended, but it was reform nonetheless. So lastly, these reforms are going to align with voters' interests only when voters have access to prisoner litigation. And what I find is that voters don't have access to information about how states are complying with the federal injunctions. And often even the judges who place the injunctions on the state systems face difficulties, let's say, in monitoring how state officials abided by those injunctions. We see federal judges having to place multiple injunctions on the same state, in part just to force those state officials to communicate how they're complying with those state injunctions to the judge. And as we expect, the interventions by the federal courts actually resulted in unintended consequences and in ways that were in conflict with voters' interests. So like I mentioned before, we see the growth of state prison systems. And as you are all probably aware, prison is very expensive. And so a single prison is very expensive. And so with the expansion of these state prison systems, the tax burden placed on people in those states ballooned. So lastly, I just want to examine prison riots. So prison riots, I'm sure you're all familiar with, but these are just instances of collective action, can be violent, in which prisoners take control of a prison to varying degrees. So they can either take control of a part of the prison or the entire prison. And as you might expect, I find that these prison riots are not internal information channels. They, for one, occur without the authorization of prison officials. When they do occur, they don't even often succeed in communicating information beyond the walls of the prison. Officials will often only report those riots when they know that information about them is going to leak to the press anyways. And then with regard to changes, riots often only lead to worsening of conditions. In the short run, they result in lockdowns and a loss of prisoner privileges, in contrast to what the prisoners are aiming for. And similarly, in the long run, we see a tightening up of security and greater control of prisoner movement. And so just to conclude, what I find in my research is that prisoner voice can serve as an accountability mechanism for prison operation. But for any reforms coming from prisoner voice, the voters need to have access to those information channels. My research also has implications for future reform efforts. And it's that future efforts need to consider the incentives of the actors involved in the criminal justice system. As we see comparing prison journalism to prisoner litigation, when reforms that are implemented go against the interests of officials, notably in the case of federal injunctions by judges, we see unintended consequences of the growth of the prison system and worsening of conditions for prisoners. And lastly, my research suggests that prison newspapers may serve a role as a guide to future reforms. These newspapers are able to speak to the realities of prison life. They can suggest reforms and identify areas where the previous lack of nuance by outside reformers has actually resulted in worsening conditions. And just to provide a quick example of this, I want to tell you about an article coming out of the San Quentin News in August 2019. So in June 2019, actually, the California State Supreme Court ruled that this California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation was not allowed to use private prisons to house state prisoners. This was in response very much to people's advocating that the use of private prisons is cruel, equivalent to modern day slavery, things like that. And so as a result of this ruling, the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation had to bring back all these prisoners from private prisons across the US. And so in August 2019, the San Quentin News staff interviewed some of these prisoners who had returned to San Quentin about what they thought of their move from those private prisons to San Quentin. And one inmate in particular provided a good summary of the general sentiment of these prisoners. He says that he was pissed off when he found out he was coming back to the state. That prison out there was much better. The overall feeling was better, that the living quarters were much more comfortable, and that those facilities weren't overcrowded like the ones in the state, that the cells were so big there and they were actually comfortable for two men to live in. And so what we can see here in this instance is this lack of nuance by the state Supreme Court, not recognizing that there is variation in how, in the type of environment that private prisons provide, that they actually made many inmates worse off by ordering the California Department of Corrections to bring them back to state prisons. They placed those prisoners in overcrowded facilities that, as we know, are dominated by gang activity, and potentially, this isn't known, but potentially could have greatly influenced their post-release outcomes. If these prisoners have to join a gang, that gang membership is for life and could very well see them recidivating. We don't know, that's a counterfactual we'll never have access to, but just something I think is good to think about when we're thinking about reforms and what is going to actually be effective. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions now. I would love any questions that the audience has.
Okay, we do have a few questions for you coming from the chat here on YouTube. The
Great.
First one is, might prisoners have an incentive to say negative things about effective management?
About like the warden, is that what they mean, effective management?
I guess so, yeah. Or
Okay.
about the whoever is causing harm to them. Or excuse me, whoever is actually providing them with effective management that they dislike.
Right, so, okay, so if that means might they want to criticize the warden, for example, might prison journalists want to criticize the warden? So yes, they might. And one interesting thing that we've seen with the San Quentin News in particular recently is it actually switched from being under the control of the warden to being controlled by the commissioner. And so we are seeing now, well, I guess that was a switching of control, but we are seeing now more criticisms of the administration at San Quentin. But again, it's going to be limited because the prisoners are there under those officials' control. So even though the warden doesn't himself censor the publication, those prisoners are living under his policies. So he could very easily punish them by finding a reason to send them to solitary, finding a reason to keep them from participating in programming, and things like that. So there are these countervailing forces sort of limiting what prisoners can write.
Right, okay. And we have another question. It says, would wardens have an incentive to cover up poor actions of subordinates? And this might have been asked before you did, I think, talk about this topic.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually a question that I'm looking at in another in another paper. And what I find is that they do want to cover up those especially bad defections by their subordinates. And this is in part because they are responsible for the behavior of those subordinates. So they don't want their superiors knowing that they let that defection happen. And so, like probably the question asker is considering, this is important given that the newspapers circulate outside the prison. If it was only internal to the prison, the warden probably wouldn't have to worry about it. But what I argue is that, and this is in part important why the warden is able to censor the publications, is that they actually use the newspapers to protect themselves within the bureaucracy, to keep themselves from being used as a scapegoat. So if there was, say, a riot, or people came to find out that maybe there's inadequate resources in the prison, the warden could divert blame. And so that's what I find in these publications, is that actually the publications are pointing the finger for any issues in the prison to other bureaucrats in the hierarchy. So we see them pointing at the parole board and saying, these guys aren't releasing enough people. They're actually not releasing people who have demonstrated that they're rehabilitated. And so putting that blame for overcrowding and any violence that potentially comes from that on the parole board. We also see them calling out the legislature for not providing enough resources. So the lack of resources in the prison, then say poor sanitation, poor nutrition, they point the finger at the legislators instead of the warden. And in this way, I'm arguing that the warden is using them to protect himself from blame.
Interesting. Okay, great. And we have one final question here. It asks, is prison journalism common? Is it only in big name prisons?
So right now, it's less common. There are about 10 publications that were circulating in 2020, at the beginning of 2020. So COVID may have killed some of them. I'm still trying to figure that out. But in the height of the prison journalism movement, I guess you could say, they were all over. So smaller prisons had them, juvenile facilities had them, although I don't include that in the graph. And it was very much, I think, accepted at the time as a way to show that a warden was progressive and implementing this programming, teaching prisoners to be literate, that sort of thing.
Right. Great. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I'll give it one more second to see if any more are coming in. Nope. So, all right. We can wrap it up then. Thank you so much for joining us. That was a really enlightening presentation. If you are interested in attending any more discussions like this with the Econ Society, you can check out our Twitter and, of course, come back to this YouTube page to see if we have any more videos coming out. We usually have something weekly, so stay tuned. Thank you so much again, Caitlin, and have a wonderful day, everyone.